Feskarma, and a very warm welcome, Falcha, to the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Sessions. Ismisha Palmia Chiblo, Shegela Hanam agus Hamia Glasgow Alapa, Isma Ur Konyachu. My name is Palmy Chiblo. I'm McGill from Glasgow, Scotland, and it's nice to be seeing you all today. I am the host of the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Sessions. Before I introduce you to our wonderful panel speakers, I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, Canada. I would like to acknowledge this land, the plants, water, animals, and spirits, and our responsibilities to them. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land and territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home today to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land and to be speaking to you all today. Miigwech and Tapaliv. Now, without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce you to our wonderful panel speakers. We are so excited here at the Plurilingual Lab for this English medium instruction and translanguaging book launch. In this presentation, the three co-editors will first introduce the volume. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Paulsrud, Senior Lecturer of English at Dalarna University in Sweden, Dr. Tian, Associate Professor of TESOL and Applied Linguistics at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and Dr. Toth, Senior Lecturer of English at Dalarna University in Sweden. There will also be some chapter contributors who will also join the book launch, Doctors Holland, Probin, Korunakova, Crisfield, Bowen, Gordon, and Wright. So just a little bit about the talk today. The panel presentation will last for approximately 1 hour, and then we will have 30 minutes for a discussion session. We will also raffle 3 ebooks at the end of the talk. And I pass it over to our wonderful panel presenters. Thank you, welcome, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. We are so happy that you could join us and that we could join you. In our presentation today, we'll have a short introduction followed by definitions of EMI and translanguaging. We will then present an overview of the book with chapter presentations from a few of our authors. The presentation will conclude with a summary of the volume's contribution to the field, as well as some suggestions for future research.
So my name is BethAnne Paulsrud. I am an Associate Professor of English Applied Linguistics at Dalarna University in Sweden. And I have a PhD in Educational Science and Languages and Language Development from Stockholm University in Sweden.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zhongfeng Tian. I'm an Assistant Professor of TESOL Applied Linguistics at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I have a PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from Boston College.
And hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Toth, and I'm a Senior Lecturer of English at Dalarna University, Sweden. And I have a PhD in Language Education from Stockholm University, Sweden.
So the 3 of us editors have all written our PhD dissertations with a focus on translanguaging. Jeanette and I have also explored EMI in the Swedish context in our studies, with Jeanette studying compulsory schools while I studied upper secondary schools. We have also written about translanguaging and EMI elsewhere. Zhongfeng has co-edited a volume on TESOL and translanguaging. Jeanette and I have written about translanguaging, translation, and EMI. And I've also written about translanguaging in families and family language policy.
So to begin, we can ask ourselves, well, what is EMI? The concept of EMI has not been easily or consistently defined in either research or practice. While it may often be associated with related terms such as TESOL or CLIL, EMI often lacks the specific focus in language that is seen in these other approaches. This definition by Maccaro, however, describes EMI as follows: the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. So EMI therefore entails the following: instruction through the medium of English. English is not the subject being taught. Language development is not the goal. The goal is not specifically to integrate language and content. Teaching of non-language disciplinary content through the medium of English is what is in focus. And for most students, and often teachers, English is an additional language.
So what is translanguaging? According to Baker, translanguaging is the process of making meaning, shaping experiences, understandings, and knowledge through the use of two languages. A growing body of researchers have called attention to the benefits that may be associated with the use of the L1 in the classroom, where the language of instruction is not the student's L1. In recent years, studies of such practices have in many cases come to use the term translanguaging. Translanguaging is a term first used by St. Williams to denote alternating the language of input and output in bilingual classrooms in Wales. Translanguaging has since then been extended to encompass other forms of bilingual language use and can be defined as the use of two or more named languages for making meaning. According to Ophelia Garcia, translanguaging focuses on how bilinguals actually do bilingualism. It is not in a linear way like the balanced views of a bicycle, but in a more complex dynamic way, like an altering vehicle using different parts and features to different extents to adapt to both ridges and craters in a bumpy ride. Furthermore, translanguaging is transformative, recognizing and opening up for new ways of being and languaging in the world. It challenges monolingual norms, assumptions of languages as single separate entities, traditions of language separation, specific limited accepted forms and functions of languages in different contexts, especially education and language hierarchies. In education, recognizing students' rights to use their entire linguistic repertoires, including named languages other than the majority language, promotes an ideology consistent with social justice. In line with other critical perspectives, translanguaging contributes to liberation from the constraints assumed by monolingual ideologies, affording both empowerment and social justice.
And now on to our new volume. We're really pleased to offer an anthology of both empirical and conceptual studies from 10 different contexts and written by 25 authors. This volume presents a compilation of studies from across the globe, all investigating multifarious intersections of translanguaging and English medium instruction. We are especially excited that several underrepresented contexts are included in our volume, with empirical studies from African contexts, including Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa, several Asian contexts, including Cambodia, Hong Kong, Japan, Kazakhstan, Maldives, and Turkey, and the European higher education context in Italy. And in their chapters, the authors have included some of the best examples of translanguaging to be found, illustrating how teachers and students make use of their diverse linguistic repertoires to make meaning and facilitate content learning at the crossroads of English medium instruction and translanguaging. And here, as Zhongfeng started to show, we just have a quick snapshot of all of our authors. And some of these authors you will meet today as they present their chapters. So we now move on to the short presentation of a few of the chapters. But first, we would like to show you our table of contents. And here you see that we have a foreword by Professor BethAnne from South Africa, followed by an introduction, and after that, our 11 chapters with empirical and conceptual studies. This is followed by an epilogue written by Professor Uti Smith and a conclusion. And as I said, now you will be able to enjoy some short presentations of a few of the chapters. And we ask that you please save your questions until the end, when we will have time for questions to any of our authors. And due to time differences, we editors will present the first chapter from the Japanese context.
This chapter is by John Adamson and Naoki Fujimoto Adamson, who both work in Japan. The context is that of a new university established in 2009 with no clear language policies. However, the Japanese Ministry of Education encourages the spread of EMI for the vague purpose of globalization. This study from this one non-elite university pursuing globalization shows how translanguaging is used in language classes through a CLIL approach to prepare students for EMI and some EMI classes in applied linguistics themselves. The study is actually a compilation of a longitudinal analysis over 10 years into 5 aspects: EMI instructor perceptions of student language and skills needs, first-year student perceptions of an English lecture course adopting a CLIL approach, analysis of first-year students' English reports from that lecture class, second to fourth year EMI course materials encouraging strategic translanguaging, and self-access center language use between center language advisors and students and between students themselves. The data has been analyzed from class materials, reports, literacy maps, recordings of interaction, interviews, and collaborative autoethnography. As a whole, this study provides insights into translanguaging use and perceptions towards language and content learning in classroom and non-classroom learning spaces.
So in brief, the results are as follows. Firstly, as for EMI instructor perceptions of student language and skills needs, local Japanese teachers want students to develop bilingual skills and practical translation, as opposed to secondary school grammar translation. Secondly, student perceptions of an academic English CLIL lecture course show those of lower proficiency feel empowered due to both content and language assessment, Japanese use in class and for referencing. Some higher proficiency students may, however, have a sense of guilt about Japanese use in English language learning. Thirdly, in the analysis of students' English reports, it was seen that Japanese references are used more for lower proficiency students on Japanese topics. Fourthly, our EMI course materials encourage strategic translanguaging in sociolinguistics and discourse analysis courses. For example, the use of L1 themes for awareness raising purposes. This acts to decenter Anglophone content. Also, as these classes are taught by English language instructors, there is an increased language sensitivity in the EMI. Finally, in self-access center language use, an initial top-down language policy of monolingual zones was unsuccessful, and what emerged was more practical translanguaging in advisor-student interaction, with the interesting adherence to English-only interaction when students interacted between themselves.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So as far as the contributions of this chapter to EMI and translanguaging go, the following is evident from the studies into this one university in Japan. Number one, policies and practices have shifted, for example, in the self-access center that they described. Two, there have been clear objectives to decenter monolingual language practices and Anglophone-centric content and materials. Three, these studies give insights into translanguaging from learner and instructor perspectives across diverse learning spaces in the university. Four, translanguaging has provided support to students, but also awareness raising and some resistance. Five, some differences in student attitudes are evident according to language proficiency. And six, the policies formed have been evidence-based and emergent. We thank John and Naoki for sending us these slides.
Hi everyone. Thanks to all the organisers for this. It's really nice to be here chatting to you all. I'm Colin. I work as a senior research officer at the University of Essex. My research looks at multilingualism and language policy in education, mainly in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And my chapter in the book draws on my PhD research, which was an investigation into language use and language attitudes in Malawian universities. So as a bit of contextual background, so Malawi is a country in sub-Saharan Africa, and estimates on the number of named languages in the country differs depending on who's counting and how they're counting. But the numbers generally agreed to be somewhere between 12 and 35, and most often people tend towards that lower number. Chichewa is the most widely spoken language in the country. And in terms of language and education policies, there have been numerous changes over the last 60 years, but they've remained very English dominant policies. So where there have been policies that include space for more languages, this tends to be only at the very early stages of education. And then as learners progress in their education, English takes over and dominates. So the most recent change to language and education policy was in 2014, when a new English only policy was to be introduced from the beginning of primary school. And this is a quotation here from the then Minister of Education, who said that it's the wish of government to see most of the pupils speak and write good English while at primary level. And English speaking has been a problem to our pupils, even those who completed secondary education. So we see here the goal of the policy is to have people that speak good English, and the best way to do this is assumed to have just English only throughout education. Since this policy was announced, it's not entirely clear the extent to which it's actually been implemented and what practical change it's had within classrooms. But this is the sort of broad policy context that the study was conducted under. And the study itself was a linguistic ethnographic in its approach. Spent time in all of the public universities in Malawi and some of the private ones, doing a range of things, so observations, classroom and individual recordings, interviews and focus groups with students and members of staff. And in the chapter, the two questions that I discuss are, to what extent can Malawian universities be considered as translanguaging spaces? And how do stakeholders view the adoption of a translanguaging language policy? So to give you a little idea of what I found and how my chapter contributes to the field. So I'm quite interested in how we evaluate things to be a translanguaging space. So here I use Leeway's original definition as spaces created by and for translanguaging. So within Malawian universities, I would suggest that they could be considered spaces created by translanguaging. And this is because translanguaging occurs both by students and by staff who engage in translanguaging practices in social and academic contexts. But I would argue that they are not necessarily spaces created for translanguaging, as at the policy level, we have these very monoglossic English dominant policies, and the language practices of students within classrooms are restricted very much by specific lecturers. So some lecturers adopt translanguaging practices themselves and they will allow students to, and some simply do not. So often students go through their days moving between different classes with different staff members who impose different linguistic rules on them. So as this quotation here from a student illustrates, they say some lecturers will say, okay, you can speak Chichewa as well as English, but then it's others who say English, so English only. In terms of language attitudes, I found definite positive attitudes towards an English only medium of instruction, but equally there were positive attitudes towards the use of a more multilingual medium of instruction. So I thought this was quite interesting in terms of these attitudes. So generally, if people had the choice between, say, English or Chichewa, English would be the top choice the majority of the time. But then when we move away from this binary idea of English versus Malawian languages to consider more flexible multilingual options, then actually this flexible multilingual option is quite an attractive option for a lot of people. So one of my interview questions was, if you could make up the language policy, what would it be? And there's a graph in the chapter which gives more details on this, but it basically goes 50-50. So half of the people I interviewed opt for a monolingual policy and half opt for a more multilingual policy. And as one student said, this is because the reality of the context is that one language isn't enough. And thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Do I just jump right in? Okay, so my name is Eowyn Crisfield, and I co-authored this chapter with Alexandra Holland and Isla Gordon, and we all worked together on this particular project. And so the only bit that I'm going to do, and then pass you over to my co-authors, is to contextualize this idea of ethical bilingual education, because I think that one of the main contributions of our chapter to the field is situating language choices for children into the dimension of ethical approaches in education, and that EMI isn't always necessarily an ethical approach to educating children in different contexts. And I think there's a growing awareness about if we're educating children only in a colonial language and post-colonial context, what messages are we giving them about the value of their own place and space and ideas? And so this chapter is situated in a school that is developing or has developed an English and Kiswahili bilingual program through the means of translanguaging to integrate local language practices into a traditionally EMI school. And so I'm going to pass you on to Alexandra Holland, who's going to talk about the school context, and Isla Gordon, who's going to talk about the actual exploratory case study that we did for this particular project.
Thanks, Eowyn. Can I have the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So the study, or the case study that we're looking at, is a school in Kenya. The language context in Kenya is quite complex. Kiswahili was defined in the 2010 constitution as the national language of Kenya, with English and Kiswahili being joint official languages. But despite that constitutional status, all education in Kenya in the national system is done through the medium of English. And English is really seen as the language of academia and business, with Kiswahili being seen more as a social language. The Aga Khan Academies, the school in which the case study is situated, is a school which is trying to develop young people who have the understandings and dispositions that are needed to make positive change in their communities. And obviously, if we want these students to do that, then language is going to be a key component of that work. And it also seems, if we go back to what Eowyn said about what is good and right, only proper that those students have a deep understanding of all the languages of their context and not just English. And so to do that, we wanted to make sure that the curriculum was delivered not simply in English, but that students had the opportunity to access academic content through Kiswahili as well. And so we looked at bringing in a bilingual program in which students would be using Kiswahili and using translanguaging as a means of using that to access the curricular content. It was seen as quite a radical step by the Mombasa community when we did it. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that some people thought that we completely lost our minds deciding to deliver the curriculum or elements of the curriculum in Kiswahili. Many of our teachers were really nervous about it. And so the case study really explores how we've used translanguaging to integrate Kiswahili into the curriculum, some of the challenges we've faced in doing that, and some of the lessons we've learned on the way to that. So Isla will now talk to you a little bit about the case study.
Thanks very much. Yes, hello everyone. So a big part of the chapter features the case study which looked at primary school children learning about the concept of ecosystems. And it talks about the learning cycle where they learnt using the medium of both English and Kiswahili. And I'll just share with you a little anecdote from our experience in working with the students and around some of the resources that we used for this. So for part of this unit, they went to a savannah land and to a game park. And we had decided that in terms of a primary source of information for them, it would be good for them to interview some park rangers in Kiswahili. So they prepared the questions before going to the park in Kiswahili. They were all prepared in groups to interview the rangers. And even though these rangers will have grown up in an informal translanguaging kind of context, using English at school and Kiswahili within the community, they actually found it very difficult to answer the children's questions, sticking to just Kiswahili, and kept breaking into English. And so we
Sorry,
We lost
Isla?
your sound, Isla.
You're
We can't
muted.
hear you.
my apologies. I thought I had clicked on it. So sorry for the delay. Hello, everyone. So just following on from what Alex was saying, a portion of this chapter explores the students.
Sorry, Isla.
Yes.
You don't need to start again. You were just talking about the Game Rangers. It just went off in the last couple of seconds.
Oh, that's bizarre. Okay, thanks. So you got up to the park rangers. Okay. And so, yes, I was just saying that, you know, I think it's important that we don't have assumptions, and obviously the careful preparation of the primary sources of information was one of the lessons that we learned. So also another part of this chapter, we do talk about some of the lessons we learned from this first experience and how we then improved the study in further years. One was also the importance of explaining the translanguaging model of education to the students themselves, because there was the effective notion of language learning here, where initially there hadn't been their understanding of why they were having to learn content in a language that they found more difficult to learn through. The other part of the lessons learnt was the importance of planning for opportunity for students to engage with quality input of both languages, using higher order thinking skills. So really making sure that they were getting access to it at an academic level, and that they had equal opportunity in both languages to be getting access to speaking, listening, and writing it, so really across the domains. Another thing that we realized after covering this first unit was the importance of tracking when the students were using each language, and again across the domains, and bearing in mind the individual language profiles of each one, because in order to develop competency levels equally in both, there were moments when it was necessary to adapt to the individual students. So finally, just to conclude, something that's not referenced in the chapter, but that has been widely spoken about in education, and that we learnt from this experience, is that a translanguaging approach like this is a wonderful opportunity to, in fact, decolonize the curriculum and to really see where we can use authentic and local sources of information for our students in a translanguaging context. So thank you very much.
So I'll go ahead and share the video from our author, Nasir Mohammed.
Hello everyone, my name is Nashia Mohammed and I'm from the University of Auckland. My chapter in the book documents a case study of the translanguaging practices of 4 children from the Maldives as they engaged in a series of storytelling tasks in the home context. Children in the Maldives are exposed to 3 languages from a young age: Divehi, Arabic, and English. Divehi is the national language of the country, but because the school system is primarily in English and discourages the use of Divehi, English has become increasingly dominant in young people's language practices. The study that I report in this chapter focuses on 4 children's use of language as they engage in 5 different storytelling tasks. The children had close connections with each other, and so we can expect that the patterns of language use documented in this study are the ways in which they normally interacted with each other. The 4 participants of the study were between 6 and 11 years of age. The study focused on these 2 questions. I was interested to see how children utilize their linguistic resources when narrating stories to each other, and how these narrations were affected by placing limitations on the languages they could use. Out of the 5 storytelling tasks that the children were required to do, 2 tasks, that's tasks 3 and 4 that you see there, were designed to draw out a particular language. For the 3 remaining tasks, instructions were given in both languages to indicate that there was no limitation on the language they could use. The tasks involved narrating a story from a set of random pictures, telling the story based on a sequence of pictures, describing a set of pictures on a particular theme, and recounting a funny incident. The findings of the study show that the participants actively made use of their full linguistic knowledge and skills to engage in storytelling. Overall, they favored English, but used Divehi in different ways and to varying degrees to perform the tasks and make meaning. The languaging strategies that the children made use of showed that they made purposeful, sophisticated, and intuitive shifts in language and adopted creative ways that not only fused their named languages, but also bridged elements from their distinct cultures. The hybrid nature of their languaging processes appeared effortless and supports the existing evidence of translanguaging practices and the agentive role children play in using language strategically and creatively. When tasks were similar to what they might be asked to do in school, the children were seen to engage in practices that would be expected at school, such as correcting each other's errors or using more formal registers when narrating their stories. The children's dominant language was clearly English, and the majority of content words they used were in English. When they were asked to restrict their storytelling to only Divehi, it affected their ability to create a meaningful story and narrate it with ease, indicating their lack of competence in Divehi in relation to English. For these children, Divehi formed a type of scaffold for their predominantly English stories, a vehicle through which they established and negotiated meaning. This study points to how children develop their second language at the expense of their first language, when the children's language is devalued in the school and the wider society. And this has implications for language education policy and practice at school. Requiring students to limit their language use to one language can not only have detrimental effects on the children's ability to perform, but could also have lasting effects on their linguistic development as well as their identity construction.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Wayne Wright, and also here on the call with us is Soviet Buen. And we'll be talking about our research in Cambodia, Translanguaging in the graduate education program there. And we can go to the next slide. If you can just click to get all the bullets there, that'd be good. All right, so Khmer is the national language, and it's the medium of instruction in the public schools, although most students start learning a second language in grade 6. But typically you get still a lack of English proficiency among many students at the higher education level. And so when higher education institutions have this EMI policy, that can be particularly challenging. And it also becomes a social justice issue, if you will, because many of the students who have that high level of English were able to pay for additional English classes outside of their normal education. So the context of this is a Master's of Education program at a major Cambodian public university. And we want to understand the nature and the use of English and Khmer within this program. And we want to explore the multifaceted language practices and views of the Cambodian faculty and also the students in the program, and then how those practices can make the course content more accessible. Next slide. And again, if you could just click through to get all the things up there. So again, the context is this flagship university. And initially when they created this Masters of Education program, the full intent was for it to be an EMI program. One of the challenges when they first started the program is most of the people coming into the program were officials from the Ministry of Education, and UNICEF or UNESCO was providing financial support for them to come into the program. And so these are people that had a lot of experience in education, but most of their working environment was in Khmer, and so their English proficiency was a bit limited. Other cohorts that came into the group included some of the younger students who had come through the university's Institute of Foreign Languages and maybe worked in the NGO sector where a lot of education work was happening in the medium of English. And so there you had some groups that were a little bit stronger in English than the original Ministry of Education folks. And then you had, varying levels in between. So that was the context of this Masters of Education program. At the time, both Soviet and I were teaching the program. Soviet was a full-time faculty member there. I was a visiting scholar as a Fulbright scholar teaching in the program. And so our participants included 6 of the faculty members, and we looked at the cohort 2 and 3 of the students. So it was about 60 students. We used mixed methodology, and including semi-structured interviews, participant observations, analysis of program documents, and a student questionnaire. If you can go on to the next slide and click through those. I'll just anecdotally share with you that when I first showed up, my students were terrified knowing that they were going to have an American professor because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to, of course, understand, the instruction, and it'd be at a really high level. And as soon as I opened my mouth and started speaking Khmer, you just saw this collective sigh of relief among the students. And so, kind of establishing right up front that it was okay to use either language in the classroom. The other thing I want to point out is, this initial data collection was in 2009. And so when we first started this study, we were looking at it through a code switching format or framework. And it wasn't until later that year when Ophelia Garcia's book came out. And when I read that and learned about translanguaging, it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And all of a sudden our data made a lot more sense to us as we were analyzing this. So in our observations, some of the things that we noticed among the faculty and the students is, first off, the idea of it being strictly EMI just kind of went out the window. They had students they had to understand, so they were using Khmer, throughout the lessons. And so some of the things they did is they would use Khmer to explain or summarize main points after presenting them in English. They would use Khmer to provide new examples or information. If groups of students met in small groups, they would usually talk in Khmer, but when they would present to the full group, they would usually do that in English. And then they would use Khmer to draw students' attention or just do things like little humorous things, chit chat before and after classes, kind of build that community. So here's the big finding, I think, for us, and that is that this translanguaging approach made the program more accessible to more students than if it had been taught solely in Khmer or solely in English. In fact, I would argue it would have been impossible to do either one of those things. Among the students and their attitudes, when we did the questionnaire, nearly all of them wanted courses taught primarily in English, but nearly all reported that when their instructors' presentations included that mix of Khmer and English, it was extremely helpful to them in ensuring their comprehension of the course content. All right, next slide. So some of the contributions we see this research making to the larger field of translanguaging is first, is very consistent with the presentations we've heard so far from the other chapters, as well as the larger body of work about EMI, particularly in these university contexts in multilingual countries. We're finding that the translanguaging as a pedagogical practice is increasingly being used to enable bilingual students to engage with rigorous content, access difficult text, and produce new language practices and new knowledge. And from a critical perspective, again, getting back to that notion of social justice, it was really addressing that educational linguistic inequality that can be experienced by students. Again, students that would have been precluded from a normal Master's of Education program now had access. And in the context of Cambodia as a developing country with lots of, a national language, but lots of international assistance, really made English an operating language for the education context. And so this kind of translanguaging pedagogy within Cambodia's complex social history and linguistic ecology, it really disrupted that EMI classroom environment that was prevalent to graduate education, while at the same time benefiting those students who have the least access to opportunities for English language development. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for having us. My name is Suluşar Kirimkulova, and I am Associate Professor at Nazarbayev University, and I'm co-authoring the chapter with Bridget Goodman, an Associate Professor in Multilingualism at Nazarbayev University, and Phil Montgomery, the former instructor of academic English at our university, and currently the PhD student at University of Michigan. So I would start talking about the nesting context, and then Bridget will talk about the study design and main findings. Next slide, please. So I will introduce the study context through the context of students, institution, and nation. So the students enter our program with a rather high English language proficiency level, 6.5 IELTS. They do take courses on academic English and academic Kazakh. Usually they know Russian and Kazakh to varying degrees, and they may have additionally a range of home languages like Mandarin, Uyghur, Uzbek, or other languages, and foreign languages as well. They are expected to become fluent and nuanced communicators among languages. So this is one of the graduate attributes outlined in the university internal strategy. So there is a multilingual approach to policy in the institution. The institution itself, where the study took place, has a graduate school of education established in 2013 with a full EMI program. The university itself is also a full EMI university, which is quite unique in Kazakhstan. We have 39 faculty members in the school, with 31 of them being international, and the majority of our faculty is bilingual or multilingual. If you walk around the campus, you will see events and signs in Kazakh, Russian, English, but you will also occasionally see them in a range of other foreign languages like Spanish, French, Korean, and etc. So finally, the country itself. So it is a multilingual, multi-ethnic country of 130 groups with 95% of ethnic Kazakh and Russian, which presents the majority of the nation, and then a wide range of other smaller ethnic groups. Trilingual education policy, which includes Kazakh, Russian, and English, has been enacted since the early 2000s. And the workplace language practices is not investigated in Kazakhstan, but it is interesting to see what happens to the students when they return to the workplace after study in EMI University. So I give the floor now to Bridget Goodman, as I told you, Associate Professor in Multilingualism. Bridget, please.
Thank you, Suluşar. So in terms of our study design, we also used a mixed methods design. We conducted a survey of students and alumni to ask them to report their development of academic skills in 3 languages and the pedagogical supports or the importance in the workplace for developing those skills. But the majority of the data in the book actually comes from interviews we conducted with one group of alumni from one of our 4 master's programs. And again, we were looking to try and figure out the impact of our program, and particularly for this chapter, to figure out whether translanguaging is a practice which students identify as contributing to their development of academic skills in English and Kazakh and Russian, and whether they see translanguaging as a practice that they are using and using successfully or unsuccessfully across languages and contexts. So it actually started as a study of adaptive transfer of academic skills. And what we're looking at is whether that adaptive transfer for multilinguals actually constitutes translanguaging. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results, for pedagogical supports, we found students report teachers are on a continuum of translanguaging practices. Rarely do teachers consciously, strategically engage in translanguaging, like requiring students to produce output in 3 languages. Many take a very English-only approach to teaching, and some are in the middle. Students themselves report translanguaging practices when working on meaning making with their classmates, but they don't identify it as a strategic or valuable approach. It's just something they do naturally. However, when we start to ask them about how applying their skills, suddenly they're talking about making very conscious choices to apply the styles they've learned in English and blend those approaches to communication for Kazakh and Russian tasks in the workplace. And you can see 2 examples of that in the quotes on the right. And depending on the genre and the communication approach, they either receive praise or criticism for that blended approach from their colleagues and employers. So we conclude from that students can adaptively apply skills across languages in ways that not only constitute translanguaging, but can be transformative. But transformation is at times resisted by peers, and as Sulashash points out, is daunting. And so the implication for teachers and language teachers in EMI is that we should expand translanguaging spaces, allow more opportunities to see it as a strategy and a resource, and increase spaces for development in multiple languages in EMI context, not only English, not only Kazakh even, but also Russian, so students can identify and negotiate these adaptations or shuffles among the languages. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Margie Probin. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Multilingualism and Diversity Research at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Prior to that, a teacher and then a teacher educator. And so I see myself primarily as an educationist, but inevitably in South Africa, education is intertwined with language and issues of access and equity and social justice, and hence my interest in translanguaging. What I've attempted to do in this chapter is really to provide an overview of research that is currently happening in South Africa rather than one study, and to place that research within the linguistic ecology of schools and classrooms. And then to look at the context for the current research. Next slide, please. So what this slide really illustrates is that South Africa is a multilingual country with 11 official languages recognized in the Constitution of 1996. Those are listed in the box on the bottom right. So these official languages include 2 former colonial languages, English and Afrikaans, that were previously the official languages. And then 9 indigenous African languages have been added to the number of official languages. So what the map shows is the geographic distribution of home languages. And also top right, the legend provides the colors. As you can see, English is the home language of only less than 10%, in fact, but rounded off to 10% of the population. So the constitutional provisions were an attempt to disrupt the linguistic hierarchies inherited from colonial times, when local languages operated horizontally for everyday social and economic use, whereas the former colonial languages operated vertically as languages of access to prestige, power, and academia. But despite these efforts to elevate the status of indigenous languages, the twin forces of globalization and coloniality have contributed to entrenching English as the dominant language in the political economy, and so too in the education system. So while, as I mentioned, English is the home language of less than 10% of the population, the majority of children learn through the medium of English from the 4th grade or even earlier, and prior to that in their home language. Although there's frequent reference to English as the language of learning and teaching in South African schools, the term EMI is seldom, if ever, applied, and this reflects the normative, unmarked position of English in education. However, the majority of learners have limited opportunities to acquire the necessary English proficiency to freely engage with education and learning in the classroom. And so teachers and learners resort to using their home languages, but covertly. And this is an unresolved source of conflict and tension, and a very typical scenario in post-colonial education in Africa and other post-colonial contexts. So EMI in South African classrooms for the majority of learners compounds historic socioeconomic and political disadvantage resulting from colonialism and apartheid. And as such, EMI is contested and politically charged. Can I have the next slide, please? So current research has long-standing earlier research, long-standing tradition. One strand looking at classroom code switching, looking really at the effects on teaching and learning of the EMI policies, and also looking at code switching and as one result, and mostly recommending that the learners' home languages should be incorporating in teaching and learning, and that the teachers' sort of covert code switching practices should be developed into strategic multilingual pedagogies. So there's that tradition of research, and then there's another strand of research which has looked at the positive cognitive and social effects of dual language English Afrikaans medium of instruction policies dating right back to the 1940s, and advocating for mother tongue-based bilingual education, including flexible languaging practices. So the current translanguaging research has this sort of historic base. Could I have the next slide, please? Much of that previous research centered around binary choices of language policy, home language or English, and what would be the best for learning. However, more recent research has adopted a translanguaging lens and searching for ways to work flexibly with all languages in the classroom to leverage learners' linguistic resources and open up epistemic access and engagement with learning. So there's research that has looked at spontaneous translanguaging in classrooms. So for example, McQueen and McKinney looked at a grade 1 EMI class in a multilingual urban school where the majority of learners were African language speakers from working class homes and not necessarily proficient in English. And they focus on the hybrid discursive practices of one learner, Tumi, who assumed the role of teacher's help as she deployed her proficiency in her home language, Setswana, as well as in Sepedi and English to support meaning making of other learners in the class who were less proficient. So she would jump to her feet and intervene when she felt that other learners were not understanding. Research in a similar urban context, multilingual urban context by Simanka and Leliot, focused on languaging practices in group work in an EMI grade 10 chemistry class and showed how learners from different language backgrounds engaged in exploratory problem-solving talk by moving flexibly across language boundaries, which were Sesotho and isiZulu mainly, to establish their science understandings in their home languages before presenting their findings in English. And so those first two studies really looked at learners' spontaneous translanguaging practices when they were allowed to do so. Probyn investigated the role of language in supporting or constraining opportunities to learn science in rural grade 8 classrooms, where the teachers and learners shared a common home language, isiXhosa, and there was little exposure to English outside the classroom. One teacher in particular rejected the hegemony of English and deliberately leveraged the learner's home language, isiXhosa, for epistemic access and engagement with learning, and worked flexibly across languages in ways that were contingently responsive to learners' language and cognitive needs. And then we have some studies too that have planned translanguaging interventions. For instance, Makalela looked at the effects of a translanguaging pedagogy on reading comprehension skills of Sepedi speaking learners in a rural school. And so the teacher introduced translanguaging pedagogy in terms of deliberately contrasting vocabulary, reading the same story in alternate languages, writing texts bilingually. And although this was a small-scale intervention, the mean scores pre and post-test showed gains for reading comprehension in Sepedi, but are even greater gains in English. Another study, Chirambo and Zano, looked at grade 10 chemistry in a rural EMI school where Sesotho was the dominant home language. Group discussions and written answers were conducted in Sesotho and translated into English. Learning materials in both languages were provided. And there was a gain of 14% pre-test, post-test on content between control and experimental groups. And there was also positive affect. Students were very excited to receive materials in their own language, Sesotho. So I'll just skip ahead then to McKinney and Tyler, where they looked at an after-school science study group and used translation of written texts to deepen understanding of science concepts. Translingual practices were normalized and learners' full linguistic resources welcomed as they worked between isiXhosa, an urban dialect, and English in translating text to deepen understanding. So this brief overview of a selection of studies covers a range of stages and linguistic contexts, but all are rooted in a concern for linguistic and learning challenges faced by the majority of learners who caught in the tension between the need for epistemic access and the need for upward mobility that English represents. And so teacher training that aims to address these issues needs to disrupt the dominant English-only, or what McKinney refers to as Anglo-normative ideologies, and open up possibilities for leveraging all languages and linguistic resources for learning in ways that open up epistemic access for all South African learners. And some of these research offers tentative possibilities for alternative translanguaging pedagogies that could be incorporated into teacher education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margie, and to all of our authors. So the chapters in our volume do not focus on the outcomes of EMI programs, nor on the proficiency of the stakeholders participating in such programs per se, but rather on a diverse range of themes exploring what happens on EMI programs when translanguaging is afforded space. Ute Smith, in her epilogue of the book, writes, "The empirical studies presented in this book do not only offer highly welcome insights into the wealth of multilingual practices in supposedly monolingual educational settings, but they also provide empirical evidence of the centrality of micro-level practices to meso and macro-level policies, including all-encompassing ideologies." So moving from micro to macro, there is, firstly, the focus on translanguaging practices in EMI, pedagogical and or communicative, and in how far they support content learning and or language learning in either English or the student's first language or languages of wider communication. The second layer of interest here combines the micro with the meso as it analyzes the interdependence between translanguaging practices and top-down language policies and how they mutually influence one another. And such research can either focus on the policies and practices directly, or on how they are experienced and constructed by teachers and/or students as main social actors. And finally, moving on to the macro level, the third layer of interest embraces translanguaging as an empowering strategy, critically analyzing EMI phenomena from a social justice perspective, and ultimately questioning dominant ideologies of education.
So in the epilogue to this volume, Smith outlines several key areas for future research. Here, we add to these suggestions with areas within EMI that we, together with our authors, have identified as warranting further critical exploration. They are as follows: effective implementation of EMI policies legitimizing translanguaging practices, translanguaging as the medium of instruction, pedagogical translanguaging approaches in EMI teacher training courses, stakeholder beliefs about translanguaging in relation to native speakerism, recognition of the use and value of languages other than English and the local language in EMI classrooms, varieties of English accepted and/or promoted in the EMI classrooms, how ideologies and hierarchies may be represented in teaching materials for EMI, content learning and/or student outcomes in EMI settings where translanguaging is pedagogically legitimized versus in EMI contexts where translanguaging is not included in the pedagogy. Explorations of multimodal data, including nonverbal communication in EMI classrooms, such as lesson observations using videos. Navigating translanguaging practices in the workplace upon graduation from EMI programs. And translanguaging and assessment in the EMI classroom. As you can see, there is much that is yet to be done. We look forward to continuing the discussion of EMI and translanguaging. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a code here if you would like to purchase a copy of the book and get 40% off. You can go to Multilingual Matters site and the code is there for PTT, Paulsrud, Toth, Tiang, 40, and you'll get 40% off the book.